everybody. This is World of Paleoanthropology, and today I'm here with James, and I'm going to let him introduce himself as we continue on. James, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm James, and I'm a principal lecturer in archaeology at the University of Brighton in the UK. And I'm mostly interested really in how human behavior, or hominin behavior, I should say, in the past of our human ancestors sort of helps to underpin our ability for abstract and symbolic thought. So when in our evolutionary trajectory do we start to use material culture to kind of engage in these slightly more complex behaviors, and whether this is something that's just in our species, Homo sapiens, or in other species too. And yeah, there's lots of other side tracks that interest me in there, like cannibalism and things like that, but I'm sure we'll get to all of that in today's talk.
Yes, definitely. I want to touch on a lot of that because, as some of our more frequent viewers will know, we definitely more focus on the strictly biological side of anthropology and like the bones and the fossils, but talking about material culture and, the things that we've done in that sort of way is definitely something new we haven't done before. So I definitely want to talk about that. And I mean, who doesn't want to talk about cannibalism? So we definitely need to touch on that, for sure. But otherwise, so what are you doing right now?
So right now,
with the pandemic, what are you doing right now?
So right now I'm spending a lot of time at home where my wife and I juggle with who gets the office and who gets to work downstairs in the kitchen. And just like everybody else, it's I think it's pretty tough on people everywhere. And everyone's just doing the best that we can, and we're just getting by. But yeah, I mean, I just hope that with all these vaccines coming through now, and the rate of vaccinations are going to pick up globally, because it's got to be global.
Right.
We'll be able to get back to sort of a more personable interaction in the future. But I've got to say, one thing that really I think has been a great benefit during the whole pandemic is the fact that we can interact with each other digitally and virtually. And I think that's really picked up, over the last year or so. Certainly, I mean, I've done talks with colleagues in India over the internet, which I would never have done before. And we're talking now, Seth, and it's really
Right.
fantastic that we can do that. And I think in an odd way, our worlds have shrunk, but they've also expanded in a slightly different dimension. So I hope that we can take the positives out of this experience moving forward.
I think that's a great way to look at it. Obviously, there's nothing else to say besides this has been a tragedy. But there has been, we as humans are very resourceful and find ways to get around problems that we find in our lives. And I think we will benefit from the solutions that we've come up with, like the way that we are talking right now. For example, like I still don't know what to call it, a show, a podcast, a project, but the World of Paleoanthropology, my site, would not exist in the way it does without the technology and the advancements that we have today.
Yeah.
And my whole point of what I do is trying to give open access and give education to anyone who wants it. People who can't go to school, people who've been to school and want to just study this for a little bit, and they wouldn't have access to any of this for the same reasons. And it's just, I'm glad to see people taking advantage of it during this pandemic when they can.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that people are, at least in many areas, I wouldn't say necessarily where I live currently in the United States, putting real effort into education and opening things up and, making sure the priorities are straight. But
I mean, we're suffering with that too a little bit, I guess, here in the UK. But I mean, for me, education is a great leveler. It's the one thing that can really change the course of anyone's life. If you can get access
mhm,
to it, and it's for me, that's why it's so fundamentally important that that you know projects like yours, where you get a chance to try and reach a wider audience, open access for free, are so important in terms of how we want to build our societies as we move forward. Because the more we know about ourselves, and that's where the study of human evolution and paleoanthropology and
exactly.
archaeology is so crucial, I think, and so fascinating. Because the more that we can understand where we've come from, the more that we'll understand where we are in the present, and what kind of changes we need to kind of try to engender in ourselves as we move forward. And I think these sorts of projects are just really, really fundamentally important building blocks to that better future. I mean, it's a term that we hear in the UK, and you guys have heard a lot, recently. But I genuinely think that there is something better that we can make, and we have to be active participants and agents in that. So, thanks so much for agreeing to speak. I mean, this is what we all need to do, and share the little bits of knowledge that we have about something with everybody. You never know what difference that's going to make. And for me, I think that's often the most unexpected, but also the most exciting parts of being an academic, and one who teaches as well as researches, is just those moments in the teaching are can be really significant for students, and indeed anybody, when we give a talk. And that's priceless in many ways.
100% agreed. Now, bringing us back a little bit more to anthropology,
Mm.
um, and to you specifically, what has your previous, because you are actually, I will admit to everyone, the first person to approach me for an interview instead of me trying to go through and get people to agree to interview with me. And that made me feel amazing. So thank you.
Thank
Um,
you.
so that was great. But that means I don't know very much about you. And I would love to hear about what you've done and how you've gotten to your position and some of the field work that you've done.
Mm.
What your favorite, let's say, era is, your favorite hominid, things like that. Like, let's give a brief overview of who you are.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's a great question. I mean, generally people aren't so interested in me as a person, but I come from a varied background. I grew up in Zimbabwe for the first 19 years of my life, and I left Zimbabwe to go to university in the UK, and that was to study archaeology. And what I really wanted to do was become a maritime archaeologist. I wanted to go and do scuba diving and look at sunken wrecks and try and understand landforms and landscapes. And that was really what my heart was set on. But like so many people, when you have the opportunity to go to university or higher education, you sometimes meet people who really just change the course of your life. And I was very fortunate to meet a hugely inspirational lecturer at the University of Southampton, which is where I did my undergraduate, called Dr. John McNabb. And he taught human evolution, and he just brought a field of archaeology that I was aware of and was interested in from hearing about the Leakeys and Oldupai Gorge, and you know, the kind of stuff that is out there in the popular medium, National Geographic and so on. But it hadn't, to me, it seemed very confusing, and I didn't really understand it, and I found it quite hard to engage with. But you know, Mac was just so inspirational in terms of the way that he spoke about these human ancestors, hominins, the way he spoke about, you know, material culture that they made, like hand axes, particularly, which has become a particular favorite focus of mine. And just over the course of that undergraduate, it's just started to change my mind and my focus of what I wanted to do to, I was really sort of ditched the maritime stuff and went down the human evolution paleoanthropology route. So I from there I ended up staying at Southampton and doing a master's in human evolution. They had a postgraduate program there, and then I sort of ended up working in commercial archaeology for about a year, doing geophysics surveys, topographic surveys, and things like that, before going back to Southampton to do my PhD as part of the Lucy to Language Archaeology of the Social Brain Project, which was headed by Professor Clive Gamble, Robin Dunbar, and John Gowlett. And then I sort of finished my PhD at Southampton, spent kind of the next 3 or 4 years in the sort of post-PhD teaching wilderness. I know that that's a, you know, it's a big issue of discussion in the States currently, and in the UK too, where it's just you're kind of looking for that first kind of opportunity to a semi-permanent post or permanent post at an institution. You're often doing these kind of 7-month teaching contracts and then scrambling for the next 3. So I did that for about 3 or 4 years at places like the University of Bournemouth. I did a stint at the University of Oxford, a bit of teaching at Royal Holloway, and then eventually I got offered a post at Brighton, and that was sort of quite a transformational point for me, because I was, whilst doing all of that teaching, I was also working on a lot of field projects. So I was sort of doing the surveying for a lot of projects in Jersey, looking at the site of the Côte de Saint Brelard, but also on the island of Lesvos, where there was a Acheulean site there. And I was sort of running the surveying, you know, the topographic modeling and the recording of finds and things on these sites, but I hadn't really had a chance to run something myself. And then when I got to Brighton, I just sort of thought it's time to kind of try and do something on my own, or at least lead it rather than being an active team member. So I kind of reignited an interest of mine that actually was first sparked in my second year of my undergraduate, which was sort of looking at giant hand axes. You know, why would you make why would people in the past make these very large hand axes, which are all very heavy? And there was one particular site, the site of Isimila in Tanzania, which I'd sort of been researching on the edges of my consciousness for about 10 years, but never really found a huge amount out about it, and often sort of getting distracted then into other projects and different research strands. But no, when I got to Brighton, I thought I'm sort of going to make a go of this, and managed to kind of get some seeding money and go to do 2 seasons at Isimila to try and resolve some of the stratigraphy and the dating of that site, and place these giant hand axes which I found there, sort of a bit more sort of clarity of their context. And I've done a couple of talks on those, and hopefully there'll be a paper soon. But from there, it just sort of then, you know, you sort of get involved in teaching and administration, and don't get into the field as much as you like, and yeah, sort of just pick up the odd sort of research strand. So the other one that actually was also started my undergraduate was on the Paleolithic cannibalism front, and I managed to kind of work on that in my master's, and finally kind of produce a paper in 2017 that got some good attention. And yeah, and then I've standard papers on sort of, you know, hand axe size and shape and form and morphology, and what that says about behavior, complexity, and cognition. So, you know, I've just got all these what might seem like disparate strands of interest, but actually the thing that underpins my, sort of the early Stone Age interest that I have, the hand axes, the Acheulean interest I have, and the cannibalism side it's all about the behavior and the complexity of behavior that's exhibited through all of these different mechanisms, and how we read that from now, and then what that tells us about these kind of cognitive capabilities and social constructions, which hominins like the Neanderthals or Heidelbergensis or Homo erectus or antecessor, how do they engage with each other? And that's fundamentally what really sort of is the constant in all of my work, is how complex, how do these creatures who look a little bit like us but don't look like us, they're bipedal and they're all tool users, but how do they think? Do they think like us at all? Is it similar? Is it different? Where is the crossover, if anything, and what does that tell us about who we are, and kind of then how we're going to react to the challenges of the future? Sorry if that was a bit rambling, Seth, but did you
No,
get what you
that
needed?
was perfect. That was perfect. I loved listening to that, as I'm sure our viewers will. And it made me come up with a few questions, which is perfect. Now, you said there's a paper that might come out, so I don't want to push you to answer this without your paper coming out. What is your hypothesis for why someone would make such a large hand axe? Because I've actually not heard of that before.
I think, I mean, it's a really intriguing question. So, giant hand axes, generally speaking, are relatively rare, I think, in the Acheulean record. Where they are found, they tend to be isolated surface finds, so they lack any real context in terms of time depth, and they lack any real context in terms of how they fit into the broader assemblage shape, which you can pick out from other sites. To my knowledge, and I'm convinced that there must be more out there that I don't know about. So if people do know about sites, please, I'd love to speak to you. It's my own sort of lack of knowledge that's perhaps holding me back here. But to my knowledge, there's three sites that have these giant hand axes within some form of stratigraphic context and in the context of a broader assemblage. So that's Cuxton in the UK, in the Medway Valley, Isimila in Tanzania, and Amanzi Springs in South Africa. So I've been fortunate enough to work at Cuxton with Francis Wembane Smith and Martin Bates and colleagues there, and Isimila, and I've been talking with the team from Amanzi Springs as well. So we're sort of convalescing and having conversations about what these things might mean, and I think that the honest answer is we don't have a clear idea. And almost certainly through that time depth across these sites, it will mean different things to different hominin groups in different locations. So there's not a single answer that's going to get there.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But I think there's probably two broad strands that we can pick out. One is that could these be symbolic in some way? Could these be a message? Because they are big. Some of the Isimila ones are 36 centimeters, and as well as being big, they're very heavy. So they're not easily, not something you can easily handle and manipulate it in a butchery environment or something like that. So because of their size, people have put forward that maybe these are cores to extract large flakes. And what these hominins have done in the past is just shape these cores into the shape of a hand axe because that's something they're familiar with and something that they know. That certainly might be a possibility. I think some of and at Isimila, you've got really finely shaped giant hand axes and really crudely shaped giant hand axes, little more than a large flake blank and 2 or 3 removals. So you've got some extremes there. So even within that single site, there's probably a difference in variation in terms of what these things are for. But certainly one thing is that it could be some sort of symbolic message, because it's difficult to see potentially what function you might use these for. But conversely, there actually could be a function to these hand axes, and that's, we don't the slight misnomer is that they're not hand axes, and that, you know, this is something you hold in your hand and that you would use to butcher your carcass. But these might be things that are actually perhaps embedded, you know, side on in the ground, so they're actually static, and then people are maybe bringing the bone to the cutting edge or whatever it is, and using it that way. So there's that, I think, you know, there's certainly, I can see how there is a functional and a symbolic element to them. I used to think there couldn't so much be a functional one, but I'm starting to revise that opinion the more I kind of think about it, and the more I kind of understand that some of these, you know, giant hand axes, certainly at Isimila, were actually found embedded in the ground. And Clark Howell, who did a lot of the original work there, writes in some of the early publications that he thinks that that's, you know, they're in situ in terms of that's how they were used. So we don't know, but they are really interesting and enigmatic. And the only way that we'll come to a clear understanding is to look at these giant hand axes in the context of a broader Acheulean assemblage. So where you've got, you know, the full range of what you might think of as normal size hand axes and flakes and flake tools and cores, you know, that whole spectrum of that Stone Age assemblage is going to give us the context of understanding about whether these giants are genuinely extraordinary or just part of a sort of continuum within the assemblages that they found. And I think that's going to be the future exciting work that will hopefully come out with you know, collaborations once we can travel to look at these things again.
Definitely, and that is fascinating work, and I look very much forward to hearing, you know, what you guys have to say about it. So my next question is, and I just had it on this. Okay, my next question is, correct me if I'm wrong, which is completely possible, but you work with youth in Tanzania?
I tangentially, I mean, I had ambitions when I started working in Tanzania to kind of do a lot more outreach with local, you know, with people and colleagues and students from the University of Dar es Salaam, as well as students in Iringa, which is the town near where Isimila is. But we never managed to secure the funding to go back to engage in that broader level of work. So it's remained an unfulfilled ambition of mine, because, you know, I sort of really also hate this idea of, you know, research teams parachuting in to look at a site and then kind of leaving and not giving not including the local community or getting an understanding of what people think about the site that is in their community and is their site. You know, that their interpretive voice has got to come through in our work. And we've, as I say, it's, you know, unfortunately in our profession, funding is something that is really hard to achieve, to go back to go to these places in to create these kind of long-term bonds. But, you know, we're still going to try. It's an ambition of for us what we'd like to do, but at the moment it is unfortunately unfulfilled.
Well, I think you bring up a great point, that of the dropping in and just leaving the communities. It's definitely something that we've seen in the past. You know, we'll go to some small Ethiopian town and find a fossil, and tourism shows up for a few years and then, you know, dwindles away and everything. But there are success stories, of course.
Yeah.
Definitely success stories where the communities and everyone gets more involved. And I really think it's admirable that that's what you're trying to do, that you want to involve the actual community in the work.
I mean, I think it's important. I mean, I'm a bit embarrassed and ashamed that we've not managed to do it, to to really a meaningful way at this point. But it's definitely it's got to be the future of how we work in a global connected world. Indigenous people have thoughts about their heritage. Of course they do, it's theirs. And in many ways it's way more valid than anyone coming in from an outside perspective to look at it. And those voices have got to be promoted and heard. My voice is no more valid than anybody else's just because I happen through a fortuitous circumstance happen to live in a relatively rich country that might enable me to do that. And we've got to address this balance. It's hugely important going forward. It comes back to our earlier points about open access, education, engagement. We've got to do this, and we've got to be serious about it. We can't pay lip service. That's not good enough. We really got to be active participants. And I hope that I can do that. I'd like to be part of that movement. As I say, I haven't done it to the extent that I wanted to when I first started the ambition of working at Isamila, but I've not given up on it either. I've just about to finish quite a heavy administrative role where I am now, which hopefully will then start to free up sort of time to apply to bigger grants and go back and do this do this seriously and work and be a real collaborator in the true sense of the collaboration word, not the lip service that we've seen before. But yeah, there are great projects out there that do this really well, and we just hope to try and emulate those as best as possible.
And I just think, I've learned, I've always known, but I've learned more recently that there are players on different teams in anthropology. I wouldn't say there's good guys and bad guys, because no one's a bad guy. We all just have different opinions and views. But
yeah,
there's definitely different sides and different teams. And when it comes to open access, clearly it's important to you and you believe that it should be enforced. But how do you think it affects the community in general? Like, what role do you think open access, if we were to not have it, would play?
Yeah. I mean, I think it will hit differently with different audiences, I guess. So, I've tried to make any of the papers I've considered to be a useful or big contribution in a field open access, so that people can access them. But I'm a relatively minor player, really, I guess, in the world of paleoanthropology. So I'm not sure how much of an impact that has, but at least by trying to engage it in an open way, it's making knowledge and new perspectives on knowledge accessible to anyone who wants to engage with it and debate it. Having a debate to further our understanding is probably the thing that I love most coming out of papers. And if it pushes other people in a small way to be a bit clearer about what they mean in their work, then that's great. And that's certainly happened out of the cannibalism paper. There's been a few responses come through, and it's really helped clarify things, I think, at a couple of sites. And that sort of interaction is useful. So there's the academic to academic conversation that occurs through publication. But I'm also conscious when I try and write some of these things that it's not just speaking to other academics. We've got to try and speak to a wider audience. So we don't want our writing to be impenetrable to people. It's got to be kind of also engaging and easily understood. And that's a tricky balance. I don't pretend that I've got it right, but I try. And I certainly, when we work with collaborators to produce papers, we try and write in an accessible and easy to understand way. So there was a paper a couple of years ago with Julia Galway-Witham and Chris Stringer, sort of a bit of a review piece around sort of human evolution over the last million years or so. And I think, you know, that's a big paper, but I think we wrote it in quite an accessible way that kind of engages people on, you know, the paleoanthropological changes, the biological changes, the physiological changes, as well as kind of some detail on the behavioral advancements that we've seen. And I think that's important because, you know, we're not going to reach everybody, you know. Don't pretend or try to be sort of, you know, an Instagram influencer or something who has, you know, millions of followers and, you know, everything you say kind of reaches a global audience immediately. But we have to try our best. And, you know, through that, the action of engaging in changing that culture and making these things accessible and including people, and you know, we can take small incremental steps to changing the general culture of something. In the long run, all those small incremental steps will end up having a big effect. And, you know, if we can change that for future generations, as well as, you know, current generations, hopefully, and if there's a small role to play in there, then I'll be very happy. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. And I think, you know, what you're doing again is very admirable. And, you know, I like to say, in any of the work that I do, whether it's paleoanthropology or anything else, if I can make one person happy or change
Mm,
one person's life, then I've done a good job. So if
I agree.
you know, if one of your papers influences one person, then I think you've succeeded. So, um, now switching gears here
Mm,
because we don't have too much time left, and I want to leave enough time for this.
mm,
Cannibalism.
yes.
What now, when most people think cannibalism, you know, they think the Donner Party in the United States, they
Hmm.
think Neanderthals specifically.
Hmm.
Um, let's hear it. What's going on with cannibalism?
So, I mean, I think probably the way to introduce it is to think why is worth, sorry, why cannibalism is worth considering. You know what you know, our, as you've just sort of, you know, kind of alluded to, you know, it's certainly from a Western perspective, you know, our initial reaction to that word, to that act, is one of, you know, we raise our eyebrows. We sort of probably feel a bit revolted by it. It's something culturally that, you know, is not practiced. Although, you know, the more I kind of study it, the more I think that there's also a kind of there's a slight mismatch, because we raise our eyebrows around cannibalism, but of course, you know, our Western culture is underpinned by Christianity really over the last 2,000 years. And of course, you know, when people engage in the Eucharist, that's the biggest form of metaphoric cannibalism, I guess, when you imbibe the body and the blood of Christ. So actually, at a metaphoric level, something, you know, that's fundamentally underpinned Western society for the last 2,000 years is actually does have an element of cannibalism in it. But I mean, I think I'm not wishing to be contentious on that. It's just pointing out that actually it's a bit more prevalent in Western society than we would initially recognize it to be. But
Right,
I think
right.
the reason why cannibalism is interesting is is to do with our understanding about why people would engage with it. So within Homo sapien, within humans, us, you know, there's probably about 7 or 8 widely recognized motivations for why you might cannibalize. So you mentioned survival cannibalism as being one. You know, when, you know, the planes crashed or you're stuck in the mountains or whatever it is, that food's run out, people have and resorted to survival cannibalism in the past to get by. So there's that in an emergency situation, starvation situation. Then there's sort of psychotic cannibalism. So that would be criminal acts. And I guess Hannibal Lecter would be the most obvious example to give to anybody there, whether you're the Silence of the Lambs film fan or the TV series. Both are great in terms of sort of examples there. So there's that kind of psychotic criminal cannibalism. Then you've got what's called sort of nutritional or dietary cannibalism, and this is where people would eat, flesh from another person or themselves as part of their standard dietary spectrum. Then there's medicinal cannibalism. So that's where people would imbibe body parts for medicinal reasons. So sometimes you hear about mothers eating the placenta after giving birth to regain those nutrients. So that's a good example. And the Victorians actually were into medicinal cannibalism quite a lot. Then there's ritual cannibalism, which can also be linked to funerary cannibalism, where you might eat a relative or a mouthful or something of a relative who's died in order to incorporate the essence of that person into you and incorporate their memories into you, so you can carry that person forward with you in the future. So it's about, honoring the dead and respecting the dead. And then there's warfare cannibalism, which is the exact opposite, really, I think, or can be the exact opposite of that in some areas, where it's about perhaps eating the remains of your enemy, either as a denigration act or a veneration one if they had been particularly brave. So my point and here is that cannibalism is not a single act. It changes in your cultural context that you're operating in, and it can be quite base, but it can also be quite ritualized and ideologized. That's not even a word, but attached to an ideology that your ritual underpins, to kind of honor and venerate. So there's a whole spectrum of motivation there. It's not just a single act. And what kind of piqued my interest then is we've no problem assigning this whole range of motivation to our species. Of course, what happens the further back in time you go is, the evidence of cannibalism in other human species, it becomes difficult to disentangle, because we're reliant on, cut marks on skeletal remains and the context of that skeleton to try and add flavor to the context of our understanding. And what I sort of noticed when I was doing a bit of a review around all these cannibalism sites is that it tended to boil down to two specific broad definitions. It was either nutritional, so part of the dietary spectrum, or it was ritual. And there didn't seem to be any maneuverability between those two broad definitions. And so none of the subtlety of the 6 or 7 motivations that I mentioned before for our species. And where I was interested in cannibalism was, well, is there a way to tackle this question to try and get to the subtlety of the motivation? Or are we stuck with these kind of two broad motivational states because of the deep time of the act that we're trying to explain as archaeologists?
That is fascinating. I never, when I think of cannibalism, it's definitely not so, I can't think of the word, but like specified and split up. It's I thought honestly there was like survival cannibalism and like ritualistic cannibalism.
Yeah.
And funeral. I knew about funerary cannibalism. But so when you have nothing to really base anything off of besides cut marks on bones, there's really not much. I mean, is there other material evidence at all, or is that really it?
Yeah, so there's about 13 signatures of cannibalism which you can try and detect on skeletal remains, ranging from cut marks, and that's not just cut marks, it's also where those cut marks are located on the skeleton,
Right.
whether they are butchery marks or whether they are sort of cleaning marks where you're scraping the flesh off the bone, because those will have different motivations as well. People are also more recently even identified human bite marks on skeletons, so you can sort of see there where things have been consumed. And there's also looking at whether different parts of a skeleton has been treated in different ways. So, for example, Goss Cave in the UK, you've got a cleaning and a defleshing of the skull, and Sylvia Bello from the Natural History Museum has done really fantastic work on this, demonstrating that you've got cleaning of the skull, and then the postcranial material seems to kind of be butchered and consumed. But she's recently identified with colleagues some sort of zigzag engravings, which means that actually you've got a mix of treatments probably on the postcranial material. There's some ritual there. There's some consumption. And the approach that I tried to take then was in my mind, I was what kind of got stuck in me was nutritional. But what does that mean? How are we nutritious if you try and compare us to a mammoth or a horse or the other game that was eaten? What do we mean by this term? And that's kind of where I then sort of started to try and work out the calorie values of the human body, not in a macabre way, but just because I wanted to really understand, anecdotally, you would read, people describing the brain, the human brain material being very nutritious and good for you, and lots of, calories there. And, this part's really got lots of, is very beneficial to eat, but how is that quantified in any way? We've got this kind of data for other animals, but we didn't have it for us. So in my kind of 2017 paper, what I tried to do was produce a nutritional calorie model of the human body, and there are limitations to what I did for sure, and it was all based off chemical composition data of the human body. Once you have protein and fat values, you can convert those to calories, and then you scale it up for the different parts of the body there. So it's pretty basic, but I think what it did is it kind of showed that if you just look at us as an animal, unsurprisingly, we're a relatively small animal when you consider the game,
right.
that and the prey that was being eaten by Neanderthals, Homo antecessor, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens. A horse gives you a lot more meat than a person does. So and our calorie value kind of matched the body weight and the body size of the animal that we are.
Right.
And it seems very obvious, but because no one had really sort of approached it that way before, I just wanted to kind of where did we fit? And the kind of conclusions that I drew is that, well, we're not particularly nutritious for an animal of our size, and often at these Paleolithic sites, we don't know whether there's often sort of groups of people that have been that's skeletons that have been cannibalized, but we don't know whether that's a single episode or one every 10 years or 100 years or what that time difference is. But they were eating adults, adolescents, juveniles, infants, so the whole range, and male and female. So the whole population spectrum was being consumed at some of these sites. So what that kind of led me to try and suggest was actually, if we're not particularly nutritious, maybe then the default position for understanding our motivation should not be that it's nutritional or ritual, because there's very little ritual evidence until you get post last glacial maximum. But maybe our default position should be that this is part of a social cultural act. We just don't understand or know what that meaning is. That's not to say it's not for meat or for food or calories. It's just not the only explanation. And that was kind of what I was trying to get across, I think, in that sort of research.
Definitely. Now, I have one more question before we go.
Mm-hmm.
This might be, so I'm getting this mostly from a TV show, so let me know if I'm completely off on this. Is it true that after repeated human consumption, you can get sick?
Yes, if you eat in the same way that you can get you can get neurodegenerative diseases if you eat infected beef or whatever. You can get neurodegenerative diseases if you eat infected human flesh in that way, and it mostly comes about from consuming brain matter and whether you've got kind of an adaptation in the prion cells, whether you're homozygotic or heterozygotic. So if you're heterozygotic, there's differences there. So you've got a natural immunity against these neurodegenerative diseases. And I'm speaking in a very broad sense because it's not quite my field.
Right.
But if it's homozygotic, then you're vulnerable to these prion diseases, where effectively it sort of eats away at your brain, and you sort of you suffer the effects of these neurodegenerative diseases like Kuru and things like that. So it can be there, but the fact that some populations and people have this heterozygosity, a paper by Mead et al., I think way back in 2003, kind of postulated that that protection is a result of kind of either repeated cannibalism episodes through evolutionary time. So it's a common act effectively to build up a selection then for this protection. And I think we have a sparse fossil record globally for humans, yet within a small fragmentary tiny percentage of all the people that have lived through our evolutionary history, we are still finding fossils, certainly from within the last million years, that have cut marks and evidence for cannibalism. So within a small fossil remain, you're still getting the signature there. So I think Chris Stringer kind of characterized as well in I think it was one of his books, The Origins of Us. He says, and I hope Chris doesn't mind if I paraphrase him incorrectly, but he kind of suggests that actually in that small fossil fragmentary record, we're still picking the signature up. So it probably is a pretty common behavior in our evolutionary past. Does that answer your question, Seth?
It does, 100%. And you have been a wonderful guest, and I just want to thank you for coming on. I think our viewers will love hearing from you and your unique perspective on different things and hearing about these things we don't usually talk about. So just thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to people who are interested, and as you say, the more that we can do that, I think the better we can all move to get forward together.
Definitely. And hopefully we can have you on again later. But for now, I think we will say goodbye.
Great.
And so I will end
Bye, recording.
Everyone. All right.